If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story.
The rain came down in thick, relentless sheets, drumming against the roof and pooling in the dirt roads that led to Ethan Walker's small countryside home. The sky, a deep shade of gray, pressed low over the earth, drowning everything in a cold, suffocating stillness. Ethan stood by the window, watching the downpour, one hand wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, the other rubbing absently at the ache in his shoulder, a ghost from his years in the military that never quite left. That was when he saw her. The shadow in the rain. At first, she was just a fleeting shape, blending in with the storm, the kind of thing you might dismiss if you weren't looking closely. But Ethan had spent too many years learning how to see what others ignored: details, movements, patterns. And this wasn't random. A dog, a thin skeletal shape, hovering just beyond the porch light's glow. She wasn't coming closer, just watching. Her fur, what little wasn't caked in mud, clung to her frail frame, her ribs jutting out like knives beneath wet skin. She shivered violently, every inch of her body soaked, her ears pinned low to her head. He stepped onto the porch, feeling the cold bite of the storm seep into his skin immediately. The dog flinched, her soaked paws skidding backward through the mud. She was afraid, but not of the rain. Ethan let out a slow breath, dropping to one knee, lowering himself, making himself smaller. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice steady, calm. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She didn't move, didn't blink. Her muscles were locked, her body a coiled spring of fear, as if expecting a blow at any second. Ethan knew that kind of fear. He had seen it before. He had felt it before. Slowly he reached behind him, grabbing the only thing he had nearby, half a sandwich from dinner, still wrapped in foil. He unwrapped it carefully, letting the scent of food drift into the rain. The dog's nose twitched, her ribs flexed with a sharp, shaky breath. Hunger was a cruel master. Even fear had limits. She took one step closer, then stopped, her gaze flicking between him and the food. Ethan didn't rush her, didn't coax or call. He just set the sandwich down on the dry patch of porch and backed away. And then, he waited. Lightning split the sky. For a moment, Ethan thought she might run. But then, she lunged, not at him, at the sandwich, devouring it in ragged, desperate bites. Ethan watched as she swallowed too fast, barely chewing, as if expecting someone to rip the food away from her. Another scar from her past. Damn. She finished in seconds, her head snapping up, ears pinned flat. Ethan stayed still, giving her the space she clearly needed. Her body trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. Something raw. Something that shouldn't have been there in a stray. Then, something strange happened. The dog looked at him, not just a glance, a look, as if deciding something. And then, she turned and walked away. Not running, not bolting, just leaving. But it wasn't random, because as she walked, she kept looking back. Ethan felt his chest tighten. "What are you trying to tell me, girl?" he muttered. Another step, another glance. Ethan set his coffee down completely. And then, against all logic, against all reason, he followed her. But the part that got to Ethan? Her eyes, wide, hollow, desperate. Not the wild, unhinged look of a feral animal. Not even the cautious, calculating stare of a scavenger. This was something worse. This was the look of a soul that had already given up. Ethan set his coffee down without thinking. The rain was merciless as they trudged through the backyard and past the broken fence. The dog led him through the soaked, overgrown field behind his property, weaving through patches of tall grass and fallen branches. Every few feet, she checked, making sure he was still there, making sure he was following. Ethan's boots sank into the wet ground, his jacket clinging to him, but he didn't stop, because something in his gut told him this was important, that this wasn't just a stray looking for another meal. She was leading him somewhere. Finally, she slowed, stopping in front of an old, rotting tree stump. Ethan frowned. "What are we doing here?" Then he heard it. The faintest, weakest whimper. Ethan's stomach dropped. "No, please, no." Carefully, cautiously, he stepped forward, peering over the edge of the tree stump, and then his breath caught. Tiny bodies, huddled together, frail, shivering, barely moving. Puppies. Her puppies. His eyes snapped back to the mother dog, and everything made sense. The hunger, the desperation, the reason she had let him get close. She hadn't just been begging for food, she'd been begging for help. Ethan's throat tightened as he knelt down, reaching out carefully toward the tiny, trembling bodies. Cold. Too cold. Too weak. He needed to move them. Now, he turned back to the mother, still standing there, waiting, watching, trusting. "All right, girl," he said softly, "let's get your babies home." And this time, when he picked them up, she didn't stop him. She just followed, because she had finally found someone who cared. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. The rain hadn't let up. It pounded against the earth, soaking through Ethan's jacket, turning the path ahead into a slippery mess of mud and tangled roots. But none of that mattered. All that mattered were the tiny, fragile bodies cradled against his chest. They weren't moving much. That was what scared him the most. Their fur was damp, their ribs too visible, their breath shallow. He could barely feel their tiny bodies rise and fall against his arms. They were cold. Too cold. And if he didn't move fast, they wouldn't make it. The mother dog stayed close, never more than a step behind him. She didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't try to take the puppies from him. She trusted him. But Ethan saw something else in her eyes, something that hit him harder than the rain ever could. Guilt. She blamed herself for being too weak to keep them warm, for not finding food fast enough, for failing her babies. Ethan clenched his jaw. She had done everything she could. She had led him here, and now it was his turn to make sure they survived. He pushed through the storm, his boots sinking into the mud, his breath coming faster. The house wasn't far now, just beyond the trees. "Almost there," he muttered, glancing down at the pups. No reaction. His stomach twisted. "Don't you dare give up on me." Finally, the porch light came into view. Ethan barreled through the back door, dripping wet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He moved fast, too fast, nearly slipping as he dropped to his knees in the warmth of his kitchen. The mother dog followed him inside, shaking off the rain, but she didn't stop to rest. Her eyes were glued to the puppies. Ethan moved on instinct. A towel, a heater, anything. He grabbed a thick blanket from the couch, laying it near the fireplace, then gently placed the puppies down, one by one. They barely stirred. His chest tightened. The mother dog let out a soft whimper, nosing at them, licking their tiny bodies. She was trying to warm them up. It wasn't enough. Ethan cursed under his breath. He needed to act fast. He grabbed another towel and began rubbing one of the puppies, gently but firm enough to get blood circulating. No response. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. Nothing. His throat closed. "Not like this. Not when we just got here." He reached for another pup, repeating the process. The mother dog watched his every move, her body tense, her breath shaky. And then, a tiny, weak whimper. Ethan's head snapped up, another whimper. One of the pups wiggled, just a little, just enough. Hope. Ethan moved faster, using the towel to dry them off as best as he could, warming them with his hands. He adjusted the space heater closer, making sure the warmth reached them but wouldn't burn them. The mother dog lay down beside them, curling her body protectively around them, sharing her warmth. Ethan exhaled, his hands still shaking. They weren't safe yet, but they were alive. And for now, that was enough. Ethan watched them for the next hour, unwilling to leave their side. The pups were still weak, but the tiny sounds they made, small whimpers, soft sighs, meant they were fighting. The mother dog never moved. She stayed curled around them, her breathing steady, her head resting near their tiny bodies. Ethan finally sat back, rubbing a hand down his face. "What the hell am I going to do with you?" he muttered. The mother dog lifted her head, staring at him. Not with fear, not with suspicion, but with something else, trust. Ethan swallowed. Yeah, this wasn't just about saving them tonight. This was forever, and he wasn't backing out. As the storm raged outside, Ethan moved to the kitchen. The mother dog hadn't eaten much. He could tell by how frail she looked, by the way her body was still trembling, even in the warmth. She needed food. He grabbed the leftover chicken from the fridge, ripping it into smaller pieces, adding some warm rice. He set the plate down near her. At first she hesitated. Maybe she thought it was a trick. Maybe she thought if she ate too fast, it would be taken away. Old scars don't heal overnight. But then, she stepped forward and took her first bite. And for the first time, Ethan let himself breathe. She was safe. The puppies were safe. For now. But the real fight was just beginning. The night passed in a tense, fragile peace. The mother dog never left her puppies, her thin body curled around them, soaking in the warmth from the space heater Ethan had set up. Every so often she would lift her head, eyes scanning the room, ears twitching at the slightest noise, as if expecting someone to rip them away from her. Old fears die hard. Ethan understood that all too well. He sat nearby watching them, exhaustion pulling at his muscles, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Not yet. Not when he knew how easily life could slip away. The pups stirred in their nest, their tiny limbs twitching as soft whimpers filled the air. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had made it through the first night. That was something. But Ethan knew, surviving was different from living, and this family deserved more than just survival. The next morning, Ethan woke to the smell of damp fur and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the mother dog. She had finally fallen into a deep sleep. It was the first time she looked at peace. Careful not to disturb them, Ethan got up, stretching out the stiffness in his back. He made his way to the kitchen, running a hand through his messy hair. The storm had passed, but the world outside was still soaked in the aftermath. Puddles covering the yard, the wind still whispering through the trees. He made a simple breakfast, his stomach growling at the thought of food, but before he took a single bite, his eyes drifted back toward the mother dog. She hadn't eaten much last night. She needed food more than he did. So instead of eating, he fixed a fresh plate for her first. Warm chicken and rice. Nothing fancy, but it was real food, safe food. He carried the plate over and crouched down beside her. She was awake now, watching him. She didn't flinch when he got close. Progress. "Here, girl," Ethan murmured, setting the plate down a few feet away. She lifted her head, sniffing the air. But she didn't move. Not yet. Ethan didn't push her. He just sat there, waiting, watching as her hunger fought against her instincts. She had spent too long in a world where kindness came at a cost. But slowly she inched forward, her eyes flicking between Ethan and the food. Her ribs stood out sharply against her thin frame as she finally took the first bite. Ethan exhaled. There. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was a start. Ethan spent the morning gathering supplies. The puppies were still too fragile, and the mother dog, she needed a proper place to rest. The small nest he had made last night wouldn't cut it. He needed to do better. He stepped outside, inhaling the crisp, rain-soaked air, and started working on a larger, safer shelter. But as he hammered the wooden frame together, something caught his eye. The mother dog was in the yard, pacing, digging at the wet earth with frantic paws. Ethan frowned, wiping sweat from his brow. What was she doing? Then he saw it. She wasn't just digging, she was burying food. Ethan's chest tightened. Even now, even with food in her belly, she couldn't let go of the fear that tomorrow it might be gone. That instinct, the need to hoard to prepare for starvation, was burned into her bones. Ethan swallowed hard. Damn, he didn't stop her, didn't scold her. Because he understood. Old wounds take time to heal. By the afternoon, the new shelter was finished. A sturdy wooden frame, warm blankets, a proper roof to keep them dry. It wasn't much, but it was the closest thing to home they had ever had. Ethan stepped back, satisfied, then turned to the mother dog. She was watching. Always watching. "You want to test it out?" he asked, crouching down. She tilted her head, uncertain. Ethan stood and walked over to the shelter, tapping the ground softly. "Come on, girl. It's for you." She hesitated, but then slowly, cautiously she stepped inside. The puppies wiggled and stretched, adjusting to their new space. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. Because for the first time, they weren't just surviving, they were safe. That night, Ethan sat on the porch, watching the stars blink into existence. The world was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of the trees. Inside, the mother dog curled around her pups, breathing softly, her body relaxed in a way it hadn't been before. Ethan leaned back, exhaling slowly. They had made it through another day. But the real fight? It was just beginning. The morning broke with a soft golden light, cutting through the mist that lingered in the trees. The storm had passed, but the air was still heavy with the scent of damp earth. Inside the small wooden shelter, the mother dog lay curled around her puppies, their tiny bodies rising and falling in rhythm with her breath. For the first time, she didn't wake up trembling. But the scars of the past, they weren't gone. Ethan stood at the doorway, watching the quiet scene of warmth and security that hadn't existed for them just days ago. His chest tightened at the sight of the mother dog finally resting, her eyes half closed, exhaustion still weighing her down. But even in her sleep, her ears twitched, alert. She was still waiting for the world to take this away. Ethan wasn't going to let that happen. The day started the same way as before. Ethan prepared food, fresh, warm, enough for her and her growing pups. He set the bowl down near the entrance of the shelter and stepped back. The mother dog stirred, her eyes flickering open. She sniffed the air, her body tensing. Then she moved. Slowly, cautiously, not because she was afraid of Ethan, but because some part of her still couldn't believe that food was just there, waiting for her. She ate quickly, too quickly. Her ribs, still too visible, moved with each desperate gulp. Ethan clenched his jaw. How long had she lived this way? How long had she fought to survive, not knowing when her next meal would come? She finished within seconds, then without thinking, she started digging. Ethan's stomach sank. Not again. She buried pieces of food, covering them with dirt, her body trembling as she did it. Ethan felt his heart crack wide open. Even now, in safety, in warmth, she was still preparing for the worst. Because in her world, kindness had always come with an expiration date. Ethan knew he couldn't just erase her past, but he could prove that it no longer controlled her future. So he did what he always did. He sat with her, not forcing, not pushing, just being there. Minutes passed, then an hour. She watched him, always watching. Then, something happened. She moved closer. Not much, just enough. Enough to close the space between them, enough to say she was starting to believe. Then before she could change her mind, Ethan reached out. His hand hovered in the space between them, inches from her head. A breath, a hesitation. Then she leaned in. Ethan's fingers brushed against her ragged fur. For the first time, she let him touch her. Not out of fear, not because she had no other choice, but because she wanted to. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Progress. Tiny, fragile, but real. And for now, that was enough. That afternoon, Ethan had an idea. He wanted to see something. He wanted to know if she would stay, if she would choose this home, not because she had no other options, but because she wanted it. So as he stepped outside, he left the gate open, wide open. The mother dog stood at the entrance of the yard, her body rigid, uncertain. She saw it. She knew she could run. Ethan didn't call her back, didn't beg. He just stood there, waiting. If she wanted to leave, she could. If she ran, he wouldn't stop her. He would hurt like hell, but he wouldn't take away her choice. Seconds passed, then minutes. She took a step, then another. Ethan's chest tightened, but then she stopped. She looked back, at the shelter, at her puppies, at him, and then she turned around and came back. Ethan let out a shaky breath. She had made her choice. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen him. And Ethan Walker knew in that moment he would never let her down.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.